By definition, friction is a force that opposes the relative motion or tendency of such motion of two surfaces in contact. It acts parallel to the surface of contact and in opposite to the direction of the force applied. So what you have to understand, I was saying friction is the force that opposes relative motion or tendency of such motion of two surfaces in contact. And we said that it acts parallel to the surface of contact and in opposite direction of the applied force. So the definition ends here, and this is a bit of an explanation. So we are saying friction is a force that opposes relative motion. So if you have this body being pulled by a force maybe F, then if it is on a rough surface, friction takes place on a rough surface. So this rough surface will tend to oppose the motion of this body. And maybe we can, if this was F1, then we can call this F, which is the friction force. This is the friction force. So it is a force that opposes the relative motion or tendency of such motion of two surfaces in contact. So I have a ground, I have a body, or like a box, then I try to pull it to move parallel to this surface. So what happens if the ground is rough? I will have to experience a force F, which is called frictional force, between at the surface, at the intersurface that is between the box and the ground. So that force F I'm applying will experience another force that is going to oppose it, and this is going to be due to friction. The same thing happens when you try to pull anything on ground. Even when you try to move, like rub on your body, you'll always feel there is some kind of force that is opposing the motion of your body as you rub it all over the surface or all over your skin. So that is friction. Now, next is we need to look at the types of friction. Types of friction include static friction. And this is the frictional force that prevents two surfaces from sliding past each other when a force is applied. Frictional force that prevents two surfaces from sliding past each other when a force is applied. That's when the body or the object is at rest. So static frictional force. It prevents two surfaces from sliding past each other. You could have a force that is at rest. Okay? So there exists a frictional force F here. Okay? Now, when you try to apply a force just momentarily, at the moment when you're trying to apply this force, trying to pull this body, that force that you experience at that moment is what we are calling static friction. So it prevents two surfaces from sliding past each other. Static friction increases with the applied force until it reaches a maximum value beyond which motion begins. And this value is what we call limiting friction. So the force of friction or the value of friction beyond which, beyond which motion begins is what we call the maximum value of friction, called the limiting friction. Then kinetic or sliding friction is a frictional force that opposes the motion of two surfaces sliding past each other. So when there is sliding past, when you have surface sliding past each other, we shall call that kinetic friction or sliding friction. Here, it usually is less than static friction and remains constant once motion has started. So once you are having your body and on the same surface, this kinetic friction or sliding friction is going to remain constant. The static friction changes because it reaches a maximum at the limiting value of limiting friction. And beyond that, then it becomes a constant. Then we have what we call rolling friction. Rolling friction is the resistance encountered when an object rolls over a surface. So if I have an object and I have my surface and this object is rolling over, okay, if it is rolling over, is moving in this direction, the force that opposes this motion is going to be called rolling friction. This is maybe your force propelling the body in front, but then there is a force that is acting between the body and the surface, and that force is what we are calling rolling friction. As long as this resistance the body encounters it when it is rolling, we shall call it rolling friction. Then the rolling friction is generally much smaller than sliding friction because the area of contact is always small. Like I've already showed you a Shume tire that is rolling over a tarmac road. So the area of contact is very small, and therefore that friction value is also always very small. Then we have fluid friction, or what we call the viscous friction. So this is the frictional force that opposes the motion of an object through a fluid. And this fluid can be a liquid or a gas. So if you have an object moving through water, an object moving through air, the frictional force that opposes the motion or that drags down the motion of this object is what we call fluid friction or viscous force. Fluid friction depends on the speed of the object and the viscosity of the fluid and the shape of the object. So if an object is like of this shape and this is where it is moving, this force is going to be big. But if it is like this force is going, the force opposing it is going to be small. That's what we are trying to mean. That it depends on the speed of the object, that's one, viscosity of the fluid, and then the shape of the object. Now, the other area that we need to tackle is the laws of friction. Laws of friction, we know that frictional force is always independent of the area of contact between the two surfaces. Okay, much as we see that when we are moving, we are having our surfaces in contact with wherever the object surface is in contact with the surface over which it is moving. But then we shall realize that as time goes by, the friction force experienced by this body moving is independent of the area of contact between the two surfaces. That one has to be put in your mind. Then the other point is that the frictional force is directly proportional to the normal force between two surfaces. That frictional force is directly proportional to the normal force between two surfaces. We said if an object is on a surface and maybe is about to move or is moving with a force P, you have a frictional force F, then this body has a weight W and it will always experience a normal reaction R. we know that this frictional force is going to be directly proportional to the normal reaction between the two surfaces. The normal reaction here is R. And so if it is the frictional force is directly proportional to R, capital R, which is the normal reaction or the normal force, then if we introduce equal signs, then there should be a constant of proportionality. And that constant of proportionality is what we shall call the coefficient of friction. So this is going to be the coefficient of friction. Now, we are saying F is the frictional force, nu is the coefficient of friction, and R is the normal force, or what we shall always call the normal reaction. The other law is that static friction is always greater than or equal to kinetic friction. We already said that for kinetic friction is going to be a constant, but it is going to be always lower than static friction. Static friction will always be at a maximum to the limiting value. But once the force on the object is increased, then frictional force is going to reduce, and then it is going to maintain a constant value that we call kinetic friction. The maximum static friction is usually higher than kinetic friction, meaning more force is needed to start moving an object than to keep it moving. Then the other law also, we are going to say that kinetic friction is independent of velocity. Once the object is in motion, the kinetic friction remains constant and does not depend on the speed of the object. Okay, so that one should stick in our minds. So we have a number of laws, and one is that frictional force is independent of the area of contact between the two surfaces. The next one is that frictional force is directly proportional to the normal reaction or normal force between the two surfaces. The other one is that static friction is always greater than or equal to kinetic friction. And another one, kinetic friction is independent of velocity. So you have got to review and even look for more and add on these laws. But once it comes in an exam, be able to excel.